Amy, and this is Research Administration in a Nutshell, a video series where I talk about topics in research administration that people want to learn about when they first start in research administration. You won't be in research administration long before you start hearing about effort. Okay, people are going to talk about it in the context of progress reports, other support, labor cost transfers, and they'll be freaking out about certification benchmarks. And you may find yourself wondering, what is the story with effort? What is it? Why does it matter? And what do I need to know about it so that I can do my job? The purpose of this video is to give you a high-level overview about effort and enough to know what questions you need to ask to move forward with your next steps. It'll get you going, but I cannot stress enough that every organization is different, and you'll want to use this video as a springboard to learn about how your org does things related to effort, not as the be-all, end-all for effort wherein research ends. This is literally just the tip of the iceberg. So let's get chipping away. Let's start with, what is effort reporting? Effort reporting is a federally mandated process by which the salary that is charged to a sponsored project is certified as being reasonable in relation to the effort expended on that project. Okay? So if you think about it, an investigator does a lot of things. They do administrative stuff, clinical research, teaching, leadership, and all of this makes up their effort. It's the bucket of what they do. Okay? And the feds define effort as basically anything you spend your time doing in your role within the organization. Now, if you do a lot of things, then you may have buckets of effort in many different places. If you have an investigator who is just in research only and maybe only works on a couple of projects, then their effort will be allocated to just those research projects and will be fairly simple to manage, right? So basically tracking what they do is not going to be as difficult. Now, it can look different for each investigator, but ultimately the overarching idea is going to be the same. What does the researcher spend their time doing at work, okay? Some things to know about the time and effort process is that time and effort is a looking back process for the most part to say, okay, what happened in the past? The reported hours need to cover 100% of the employee's time. We'll talk more about that later. And that time, and the time is calculated as a percentage of said time, regardless of whether they're full-time or part-time, okay? It's not about being 40 hours a week. It is about however many hours you work in a week, right? So let's say, for example, people usually work about 80 hours, 40 hours a week times 52 weeks. And if somebody worked 100% on a project, typically we would associate that with 80 hours. But let's say this person, this PI, works 5,000 hours, right? That then becomes 100%. Okay, so 100% is whatever it is that they worked on. And so that becomes the denominator. It's about the percentage of the time, not about the exact hours. And the effort on work that is done must be reported whether or not they are paid from that source. Okay. Now you may be asking, wait, how would you do it if somebody is devoting effort and not salary? So what about if they're not paid from the source that the effort is being expended on? This may happen for a few reasons. Someone may get a grant, they may spend a lot of the grant and then not have funding for their salary towards the end. And so now they have to do that work. They still have to work on the project. They still have to put in the effort that they said they would, but someone still needs to pay for that time, even because the grant doesn't have that money. So, what we typically report in those cases, someone spent effort on the project to how awesome puppies are, but the salary for that particular effort was covered by a discretionary account. Sometimes operating accounts will cover those expenses, and that's called the cost share. Now, cost sharing cannot be done to a sponsored project. It has to come from a non-sponsored account. Okay, so you're never going to be able to have NIH pay for work that's being done on the DoD or JDRF paying for work that is being done on an American Heart Association. They're not going to be okay with paying for effort on work that is being done on someone else's project. So typically, effort follows the project, salary follows the effort, and if there is no salary, then it becomes discretionary salary that then covers the effort. Now, there are cases, just have to throw this out there, there are cases in which the nature of the award itself is a cost share, right? So they're basically paying for research to be done in a certain project and they're protecting that time. Or you may have situations in which an organization is willing to pay to cost share somebody's salary. Those are going to be rare. Always look at the announcement, always look at the award. That's where you're going to find it. And the only reason I want to bring this up is because you're not typically going to see this, but I've seen so many different things over the years. You never know when you're going to run into a certain situation. So always look at the announcement, the award, the guidelines. Now, cost sharing can be mandatory or voluntary. So there are some cases in which a an investigator is performing activities as part of a cost share agreement, right? So the university's contribution to a particular project is going to be that they're going to pay for a portion of the effort that's being devoted onto this research project. If that is the case, where the institution says, okay, you put 20% effort on this project, the project will pay for 10 and we'll pay for 10. That then becomes, first of all, that's voluntary, but also, and in some cases it can be mandatory, but if it is written in to the application, then it has to be tracked and then reported on. Okay, so if you commit to doing cost sharing, you have to report on it. Now, in some cases, there are many awards in which there are submissions that the sponsoring agency wants the organization to have skin in the game, and so they require them to pay a portion of the salary or a portion of the equipment or whatever being expended towards research. But as I said, if it was committed to, it needs to be tracked along with the cost sharing effort. Now, depending on the agreement, there may also be reporting requirements at the end of the award cycle to demonstrate the compliance with committed cost sharing. Okay, so how do you calculate it? Let's do a deeper dive. Now, when you're talking about calculating effort, it essentially involves estimating a percentage of time spent on each project or activity for a person. Now, the total percentage of time worked cannot be more than 100%, because the amount of, if you work 5,000 hours, then that's 100%. If you work 2080 hours, then that's 100%. But that's whatever you work, that's 100%. Okay. And the time spent on a project needs to be compared to a report of the actual pay distribution in the accounting system to make sure that, okay, 10% effort is being expended on this project, 10% salary is being expended on this project, and we are commensurate. Everything is copacetic. Okay. Now, this has to happen in the context of someone's entire effort bucket. Okay. So if somebody has 20% administrative effort, let's say they have a role as a director and that's 5% effort, then that's 25% of their effort that is already expended on something else, which means they only have 75% effort to be able to spend on research. So when you're looking at their research, other support, and their grants, and when they're submitting, the question becomes, do they have enough for that 75? Not do they have enough for 100%, right? Because that the 25% counts as part of what they're doing, and you can't exceed that. Now, if someone is entirely research, and there are many investigators who are entirely research and they don't have any of these ancillary activities, then in that case, you calculate it based off of the 100%. A lot of times this is going to be based on, you'll see this with fellows and people who are not in academic positions that don't have training requirements and director and education and administrative requirements. Okay. Now, once you've calculated the effort, so like basically you calculate the effort for that person, and then it's based on 100% of research, and then there is a close for the month. So the month closes, typically it's about in the second week of the following month. Okay, so when it closes, that effort becomes on the record, and then periodically the investigator needs to go and certify that the effort was correct and true, the salary is correct and true, and that becomes the certified effort that is on record now. Okay, so there's a whole process of tracking people's effort when they work on sponsored research. Now, you may ask yourself this question that says, okay, but what about the time that someone spends writing grants? Let's say somebody is 100% research and they work entirely on their projects, like that's it, they don't do anything else. What happens if they're writing a grant, right? That counts as work that they're doing. What does that fall under? So if someone's 100% of research projects and for neurosurgery, let's say, and they're writing grants, then aren't the grants that they are currently on paying for that PI to write and submit a grant to another sponsor? And the answer is technically yes. And that's why a lot of organizations will have a buffer space in their policies and procedure statements that says that that portion of effort on an investigator's report needs to be compensated for by non-sponsored funds. And that's sort of meant to be a good faith action to cover those non-research activities. Now, what's really interesting is if you look online, you don't often find people giving like hard numbers. So the University of Wisconsin says faculty are expected to engage in a lot of activities, including non-sponsored research. The department is responsible for making sure that their effort does not go over 100% and that they have space available to write. Washington University in St. Louis, they don't actually give you a number to say, this is how much space in an effort you need to have. They say use your best judgment. Other organizations do have like a percentage number, which is really interesting, is that I've not found it publicly printed, but I do have worked at organizations that have like an actual published number for internal use, so that the people who are sort of managing the grants know. But when I looked online, what I found is that the general policies available to the public, at least, were very vague in terms of how they define that little space for writing grants and doing other things, and how it's done. So I think that is on purpose. I think that is on purpose. So that's something to just keep in mind. The thing to do would be to find out what is your organization's best practice, and what do you need to do to ensure that your PIs are being compliant. Now, if your organization does not have that buffer requirement, then you may want to ask your manager about how that challenge is being addressed in your organization, because it is a challenge. Regardless of whether you have the requirement or not, that challenge still exists. So when we're tracking percentage effort, that's fairly straightforward. Okay, so that is, we're saying, okay, 10% of 10 hours, is 1 hour, right? That's no problem. It gets a little bit more complicated when you start doing effort using person months, calendar months, academic months, and summer months, which is another metric of measuring effort. It's framed differently. Depending on the organization that you're reporting to, they will want either calendar months or they will want percentage. Now, the good news is that the calendar months, person months, those are also based off of the percentage. So like it's taking the percentage and then taking it one step further, but it is a little bit more complicated. Now, a person month is the metric that is used for expressing effort that a principal, investigator, or faculty or staff or personnel devote to a specific project. That's based typically on the kind of appointment that an individual has at the organization. In some organizations, it's going to be a calendar year. So any type of effort you do is going to be calendar months, and you're never really going to have to worry about academic months or summer months. In a lot of teaching institutions, they have it broken up into calendar, academic, and summer months and winter months. So they have a completely different calendar for. There's a lot of variety in there. And then when you see how the effort is reported, it'll often be reported in 1, 2, or 3 buckets, depending on the kind of structure the organization has. Now, some institutions define their academic year. Okay, so when we go into academic year, some institutions define their academic year as a 9-month appointment. So it's 9 months in the academic year, while others define it as a 10-month appointment, right? The key is to really just know the base of the months that you're working with. That's pretty much all you're doing. Is what is the base of the month that I'm working with? Am I working with the 2 summer months? Am I working with the 9 calendar months? Am I working with the 2 summer months? Am I working with the 9 academic months? Like, what am I doing? Once you know that base, then you just do the percentage and multiply it by that base. Okay, so to calculate person months, you just multiply the percentage of your effort associated with the project times the number of months in your appointment. Okay, so for example, if you were to do 25% of a 9-month appointment, that would equal 2.25 annual person months, right? So if you annualize it, okay, 10% of a 12-month calendar year equals 1.2 calendar year months. Now, the thing is that every time I go, most of the time this isn't very difficult. Like, there's standard and it's not a big deal. But there are times where I have to work on projects where I'm dealing with a lot of different types of effort and trying to balance many different things. And I actually found that this resource on Yale is just so invaluable. It breaks everything down into percentage effort, into person months, into academic months, into summer months. It's a great tool. I recommend bookmarking it. The link is in the show notes on YouTube at manessa.tv, or you can find it on my blog at manessa.com. So how do you decide what effort goes where? Now that you know what it is and you know the units of measurement that we employ to calculate effort, the next question becomes, how do you decide what effort goes on what projects? And what are you tracking it against? Always start with the application, because that's where the sponsor starts. Typically, there will be rules from your sponsoring agency around how they treat effort. Always read the guidelines, the NOAA, and of course the application as your starting point. Now, once the grant's been awarded, then the proposed effort becomes the accepted effort, okay? This is the amount of effort proposed that the sponsor accepts and awards regardless of salary support that they provide. The proposal or commitments may be included in the notice of grant awards. They may actually say, here, this is the effort that you said you were going to expend. This is what we expect you to expend. But typically, they just assume that what you submitted is what is going to be adhered to. It varies by agency. Now, if it's not there, you can look in the proposal and it'll be there. Okay. Now, if there was cost sharing committed to at this time, then it now becomes binding and you're going to need to track it. Now, Effort is not always set in stone, okay, and there may be allowability in terms of wiggle room and flexibility. So, for example, the NIH will allow you to adjust effort within 25% of the originally committed effort without obtaining prior approval, while some other sponsors will not. So, when the grant is awarded, you will work with your investigator within the framework of their effort as a whole, the new project, the project they had before, the allowable flexibility for this project and others, and come up with the whole picture of someone's effort that will be devoted to the project, charged to the project, and ultimately tracked and certified. So how do you track it? Charges to the federal awards for salaries and wages must be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. I know I keep saying that, but it literally is the basis of the entire concept of effort, so it bears repeating a dozen times. And according to the CFR 200 430, the records that we keep need to follow a certain set of guidelines. So they've made our lives a little bit easy by telling us here, this is what it needs to follow. They need to be supported by a system of internal controls which provides a reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. They need to be incorporated into official records. Remember earlier when I said it becomes part of the official records? That's what that means. It has to reasonably reflect the total activity for which an employee is compensated, not to exceed 100%. It has to cover all of their activities. So if they are required to report effort, then they are required to report effort on all of the things. Okay. If they're not required to report effort at all, then they don't need to. But if they are required to report effort, then they need to have that recorded somewhere. They need to comply with established accounting policies and practices and support distribution among specific activities and and support their effort distribution among specific activities or cost objectives. Now, depending on the size and complexity of your organization, you may have differing levels of tracking. For a small biopharma company, you may have a spreadsheet and some forms that get certified regularly. For a larger organization with multiple departments, there may be an electronic certification system of some kind. Many organizations have systems that integrate payroll and effort reporting so that the RA is only involved minimally once the effort is set up. Others have a lot of manual steps that need to be taken to ensure compliance. And so how you see this practice play out is going to differ wildly from place to place, but you can be sure that they will cover these requirements in some form. Now, as a caveat, I have had some clients who are new to research and who are just starting out, so they actually did not have any of these systems in place. So if that is something that you discover your organization does not have, then you may want to get that in place as soon as you possibly can and put a mitigation plan in place. Definitely consult your legal counsel. This can be one of the more, this has actually been one of the more costly projects that I've engaged in over the years. Cleaning up past effort and ensuring the financial records match the certified effort, and then creating effort policies to support those activities. But it does happen, and it's still cheaper than having an audit finding. So hiring someone to come in and sort all this shit out for you is still going to be cheaper than having an audit finding. And believe me, you do not want this to be your audit finding. More on the consequences later. We'll talk about that later. Okay. So, all right. So who has to track their effort? Again, all employees, not contractors or consultants, who are paid in full or in part with federal funds must have their effort tracked. Not everyone needs to certify their own effort, though, but someone with knowledge of the project needs to review and confirm that it's accurate. So typically that will be the PI. You may have a fellow who doesn't really track their own effort at the grant level. They just focus on doing the research, and then the PI is the one who directs their work and makes sure it's allocated appropriately in terms of spending during your monthly reconciliation meetings. Now, officially, that is reported annually during the progress report stage on the all personnel report. And if you want to learn more about progress reports and all personnel reports, you can check out the video I did on that on YouTube at Manessa.tv or on Manessa.com. Someone has to review the effort each month, preferably proactively and retrospectively, to confirm that the effort on a project is accurate. Typically, this will be the PI who reviews that salaries are allocated as they've directed the work of the people who are on the project. Meeting with your PI regularly gives them the opportunity to tell you who's working on what project so that salaries can be proactively allocated. There is an excellent video that I made all about how to develop those relationships with your investigators so that you do know these things in advance on Manessa TV or Manessa.com. Now, for anyone who is key, they are required to actually review and officially certify their own effort to confirm that the effort was devoted to the project in this distribution. Okay, so the PI can certify for fellows and for research assistants and everybody that is not them and themselves, but the key personnel need to certify their own effort. Okay, this will include verification through either electronic signatures and documentation from individuals with firsthand knowledge incorporated into official records. Okay, now let's talk about the super scary part. What happens if you are not compliant with effort policies? Okay. So tracking performance on a sponsored project is typically necessary as proof of time and effort during audits. Being audited is not a huge deal, depending on the size of your organization and your amount of spending. It could actually be a very routine event that happens often. And it could be a routine event. However, they will check what the effort situation is, and the payroll and the salary and so on, because that's one of the biggest and quickest, easiest ways to find if there is a mistake. Okay. Now, generally, okay, if you've never had an audit, even if they're routine, they are nerve-wracking. And it's hard enough if you are working your ass off to be compliant, right? God forbid you're non-compliant. Okay, so let's just start with this. Regardless of the size of your organization, when we're talking about consequences, don't be non-compliant. Just don't be non-compliant. It's not worth the time. It's not worth the effort. It's not worth the hassle. Not to mention, it's not good business practice, and it costs a lot of money to retrospectively go back and clean up than it does to maintain accurate, proactive, and retrospective records. Like this is usually the biggest thing that I come in for is cleaning up situations where there was too much work. They didn't want to hire more staff, and here we go. Okay, so our job is one where you have to have good judgment, and there are areas where you can be gray on, and then there's areas where you can't, and this is one where you can't. Okay, so you'll end up saving yourself more time by taking time to maintain compliance than you will fixing the problems that arise later as a consequence of not doing that. First off, it does happen, and there are steps in between to resolve these issues. It doesn't go from, oh my God, I found this problem to, oh my God, we're going to get fined $1 million. That's not how that works. Typically, you find it, you have plenty of opportunities to fix it, to mitigate it, to sort it out. Those are outside this conversation, so you can always check out Manessa.com or Manessa.tv for instructions on how to do those kinds of things. But typically, there's a whole process that you go through before you get to the point of having to pay prices and consequences for having done something incorrectly. Okay, so let's say you do find that something went wrong. Okay, so after you've tried to mitigate it, what are some of the consequences that can happen? The first is you can have a disallowance of all charges that are relevant, which is the bare minimum. Just basically take them off, put them somewhere else. No big deal. You can have a loss of federal and non-federal sponsor funding for the institution because now you've been found of having been non-compliant and other organizations aren't going to want to do business with you. It becomes a whole thing. There can be monetary fines to the institutions. For investigators, there are monetary fines. They can be debarred from receiving federal funding, and there are legal charges that can be filed. When we do our checks in the beginning of during a submission for debarment, I did a video that you're welcome to check out on how do you see if someone has been debarred and why do you need to do it. That is one of the consequences of not be compliant in the effort policy space. Now, that's a general overview, but if you really want to hear the horror stories, you don't like hear how bad can it really get, then here's a tea on some organizations that have been non-compliant over the years. The University of Minnesota had to pay $32 million because some salaries were charged to a grant in excess of employee effort that was spent on the grant. And there was no way to verify, and so they got fined for that. Northwestern got fined $5.5 million because the investigators overstated their effort on research projects. Johns Hopkins got fined $2.6 million because they had overstated their effort reports, the effort put on a project. Florida International University, they maintained incomplete records related to time and effort. So theirs was actually, they didn't have complete records, and they got fined $11.5 million just for not having complete records. Okay. That's not even that's the process not being in place completely. So that's not even a finding as much as it was, well, we can't tell. Right. Weill Cornell, they had one where they basically had to pay, I think, $4.3 million because they had employees who didn't work on the project, who were charged to it. Now, those are just the ones that have been publicly reported. In the last decade or so as a consultant, with a network of consultants who works with small businesses, one of the biggest challenges that smaller and growing organizations run into is that they don't have a way that they're tracking this information. And so they need to come up with ways retrospectively to track, record it, create the records, and so on. And typically they have to work with someone to bring them into compliance, which is costly. Depending on the size of your organization, this may or may not be relevant. However, if you are a newer organization or a smaller organization that is just now embarking on research, this may be an area that you want to look at. If you were interested in further resources, because I know I went through a lot, but this is honestly, that is the overview of a lot, because there's a lot more that you can go into. What I would recommend doing is checking out Manessa.com. There's a blog post there for this, and links to resources that will help you, including that fabulous little chart from Yale. But if you're brand new for effort in your organization and you're not sure how to get going, then here's what I'm going to recommend that you do. Look up the following information to get started. So first, I would find out what is your area of responsibility related to time, effort, salary, and so on. Depending on what you find based off of what your responsibilities are, you'll want to do some or all of the following. You'll be figure out who is being paid from what grants under your investigators and what are their roles. See if they were on the original application. Check with your investigator to make sure that everyone who is being paid off of their grants should be being paid off of their grants. So get that list together and ask them. Do a retrospective analysis of the last year of salary and effort on each of your projects to make sure that there's nothing out of whack. You'll probably need to consult with your PI to be sure, but that gives you a real deep understanding of this new portfolio that you've got, and your PI will be able to let you know what needs to be corrected. And you become the hero because you found the problem that you're going to solve. If things are not where they're supposed to be, you solve the problem. If things are where they're supposed to be, great. Now you know you have your baseline. Find out who your key personnel are. So like in the list of your portfolio, who are your typical key personnel and who are the staff that they work with. You will likely have a portfolio of the same PIs over and over again. Get to know them. Who are they? Who are their staff? Check out my videos on how to get to know your investigator. It will help you enormously. Regardless of where you've fallen into this, going through effort for each individual is a process. And you may have some PIs that are super easy and everything has been posted correctly. And then you'll have a couple that are going to be your personal nightmares that are going to take weeks and months of collaborative effort to unravel. Don't ever hedge away from doing the investigation because you're afraid of what you're going to find. You finding problems is the best case scenario because now it can be fixed. And once you do have everything in order, you'll find that your day-to-day management of your portfolio is actually a lot easier and more enjoyable because you're not worried that you've done something wrong or that there's a compliance guillotine just waiting to come down on you. And lastly, this will give you a framework of good questions to ask your manager, and it will fill both of you with incredible amounts of confidence. I'm Manessa Konecki. Thank you so much for joining me on this video on effort. If you found it helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss a single research administration video. And make sure to get this in the feed of your friends so that they can learn from me too.